So the social contract or social contract theory says that communities, political communities, are based on agreements. In every community, people come together and they agree on a set of rules or laws that will govern their life together. The social contract is supposed to be this thing that binds us all together. If you live in a society, you are bound by the social contract. But the really strange thing is that this contract, this document, is essentially imaginary. If you read social contract theorists, they all gesture towards this point in time, this moment in the past when we supposedly all got together and signed this contract. But historically speaking, that never happened. I didn't sign this contract, did you? Consider this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is one of the most influential social contract theorists, says that laws are merely the record of our own wills. Are they though? Like a record of what? When was this record taken? Was I there? Were you there? Was anybody there? But if you live in a modern democracy, your government, the political philosophy that underpins your whole way of life, is based on this imaginary contract that none of us ever signed. There are two reasons why this might be a problem. First, the social contract is supposedly the thing that gives our laws and our governments their legitimacy. These institutions are supposed to have authority over us because we have granted them that authority. But if we never really agreed, if we never really granted them that authority, does that call the legitimacy of our laws and governments into question? Maybe we can say that the social contract is just a metaphor. It's not real. It's not meant to be taken that seriously. Political life does often feel like a transaction. The state gives you certain benefits like security and infrastructure. And in exchange, you agree to give up some of your natural liberties. You agree to abide by a certain set of rules and norms. So the state supplies you with roads and fire departments, and you agree not to take off your pants in public or smoke in hospitals or do whatever this guy's doing. And here's the second problem. Even if the social contract is just a metaphor, it's such a foundational metaphor that it still shapes the way we think and talk about politics. Like one of the premises of the social contract metaphor is that all human beings are motivated primarily, maybe even exclusively, by material self-interest. So we care about our body and we care about our stuff. So the question is, does this metaphor produce a politics that reinforces for us the idea that we're all materialistic and self-interested? So where did the idea of the social contract come from? And why does it have such a powerful hold on us? Let me tell you about that. So our Western conception of the social contract is basically traceable to these three European dudes: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'm going to talk a bit about all three of these guys, their various contributions to social contract theory, and then at the end of the video, we'll talk about some critiques and some limitations in their thinking. So let's start with our man Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes was an early modern empiricist. He was an empirical philosopher. This means he was an early supporter of the scientific method. He was actually, for a time, the secretary of Francis Bacon, who's one of the architects of the scientific method. Hobbes wanted to use this new science, this emergent science, to better understand human nature. Hobbes was especially interested in why we, as natural beings, as animals really, why do we enter into political community? Why does it seem to be in our nature to organize ourselves into political groups? What drives us to do it? And what is it that we hope to get out of our participation in political community? So in his very famous book, Leviathan, from 1651, Hobbes tries to imagine what human beings were like before politics. What are we like in our natural state if we stripped away all the customs and conventions associated with society? You know, if you could restore human beings to their factory default, what would we really look like? And this leads Hobbes on one of the most famous thought experiments in the whole history of Western philosophy, where he invites us to imagine the state of nature. In short, Hobbes argued that outside of politics and society, in our natural state, human life sucked. Without laws to keep us in check, human beings are self-centered, we're predatory and violent. And so, in order to protect ourselves from violence and to keep others from taking our stuff, we agree to sign on to the social contract. That might look something like this. Okay, gentlemen, thank you for coming. Now, our problem is that every time someone around here gets hold of a banana to feed themselves, someone else seizes that banana either by force or fraud. Give me a banana. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So I've been thinking we need to come to some sort of agreement where we all agree not to hurt each other. I won't do bad things to you. You don't do bad things to me. I won't take your bananas. You don't take my bananas. Sounds good. I'm in. What are you guys doing? Signing a social contract? Yep. No more banana theft. That'll never work. Why not? Give me a banana. We just agreed. I told you. See, the easy part is making the agreement. The hard part is getting people to abide by their agreements. Like making sure they won't actually hurt each other or take each other's stuff. Yeah, full disclosure, I was going to sign the contract and then wait for you guys to fall asleep and then steal all your bananas. That's smart. So what do? We just keep fighting over bananas for the rest of our poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives? You need a sovereign.
A what?
What? A what? A sovereign. So for Hobbes, the sovereign was this kind of amalgamation or conglomeration of the collective will. And crucially, it's imbued with power and authority to make executive decisions for the whole group. The sovereign could take different forms. It could be like a legislative assembly, or it could be like a monarch, like a king or a queen who's placed in a position of authority, some executive decision-making office. And critically, the sovereign is empowered to uphold the social contract and to make sure everyone is abiding by their agreements. For Hobbes, the preservation of your body from danger was really the whole appeal of entering into a social contract. So you wanted a political authority who could make people obey the rules. This is actually what leads Hobbes to the conclusion that the best regime, the regime we all really want, is an absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy where one person is going to set the agenda, make all the rules, and the rest of us just comply. The rest of us are just obedient. Because even if those rules are unjust or irrational, even if the laws are unjust, we would rather live in that orderly, obedient society than live in the state of nature, where everybody's stealing your bananas. But does that really make sense? Like if you were going to sign a contract to set up a society, would you really sign a contract that gives another person, some guy, absolute power over you and your property? Enter John Locke. John Locke is another very influential social contract theorist, and Locke makes a relatively minor but enormously significant modification to Hobbes's basic philosophical framework. Still believes in the state of nature, still believes in the social contract, but Locke argues that life in an absolute monarchy, where one person has absolute power to decide whether you live or die, who can change the laws at will and act with total impunity, that's really no different than life in the state of nature. Hence, it is evident that absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. For wherever any two men are who have no standing rule and common judge to appeal to on earth for the determination of controversies of right betwixt them, there they are still in the state of nature. Locke argues that absolute monarchy is out. You either need a republic like the United States, or you need a constitutional monarchy, something like Canada, say, where there's still a monarch, but the powers of the monarch are really limited. And Locke's thinking has just been so influential to the modern world. Locke was enormously influential to the American founding. When you think of the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights, you can see this is like kind of social contract theory at work. Similarly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I mentioned earlier, hugely influential in the French Revolution. Rousseau also deviates from the Hobbesian tradition and is more in line with Locke, emphasizing human freedom. In his work on the social contract, he writes, "A people is a people before it gives itself to a king." But if we actually stay with this passage and keep reading, we get back to the problem I was talking about at the very beginning of this video. A people is a people before it gives itself to a king. This gift itself is a civil act. It presupposes a public deliberation. Thus, before examining the act whereby a people chooses a king, it would be well to examine the act whereby a people is a people. For since this act is necessarily prior to the other, it is the true foundation of society. So what's Rousseau saying here? His point is that before we got together to sign the social contract, just like theoretically, there must have been a point before that where we decided to get together. When did we have the meeting to sign the social contract? And if there was a meeting, when did we have the meeting to decide we were going to have that meeting? Because even if you think about like a contractual moment, like the American founding, this depends on the idea that these people who are actually signing the document are authorized to sign on behalf of everybody else. And in a representative democracy, this makes sense. But, is everybody in the community adequately represented by this group of people? A lot of white guys representing the interests of everybody. That's in fairness. So Rousseau really does seem to be trying to figure out, like, okay, but when did the moment happen, right? Like, when did the social contract come into being? And he has kind of an elegant and somewhat satisfying answer to this question, which seems to be that the moment we begin to deliberate about living together, we have entered into a kind of contract with each other. That as soon as we start to think about living together, we have already conceded that we are in a relationship with each other. Look, maybe I'm making too much of this. This has bothered me for like almost 25 years, but maybe it's not that big a deal. Maybe it doesn't matter that there wasn't actually a moment when we all signed the contract. Maybe it's just a metaphor. Look, it's just a way of talking about political life and living together, and a way of thinking about our obligations to one another, what we owe to each other. But if it's the case that the social contract is just an explanatory fiction, then I want to suggest that it does carry with it certain problematic consequences. It shapes the way we think about political life. Think about it this way. Don't we always, in politics, I'm just editing this video, don't we always hear arguments like, why should my tax dollars go to put your kid through school? Why should I have to pay for your healthcare? And at the root of these arguments is this idea that I am only participating in community insofar as it serves my self-interest. What's in it for me? And doesn't this suggest that the social contract framework actually makes it really hard for us to think communally? One thinker who decades ago exposed this problem with social contract theory was the philosopher Virginia Held. In her essay, Non-Contractual Society, a Feminist View, Held writes, when subjected to examination, the assumptions and conceptions of contractual thinking seem highly questionable. As descriptions of reality, they can be seriously misleading. Actual societies are the results of war, exploitation, racism, and patriarchy far more than of social contracts. So Held's claim here is that the social contract is not a historical phenomenon. Political communities aren't created by groups of people gathering around a table signing a contract. It's much more common for revolutions, colonialism, imperialism, the rise and fall of empires, wars. Those are the things that actually create governments and nations. But moreover, Held even takes aim at the philosophical utility of the social contract. She questions how useful it is for us to think of ourselves as disconnected, self-interested individuals who enter into society by signing contracts with each other. To see contractual relations between self-interested or mutually disinterested individuals as constituting a paradigm of human relations is to take a certain historically specific conception of economic man as representative of humanity. So Held here identifies a major problem with these state of nature, social contract thought experiments. What could possibly be wrong with this thought experiment?
I can think of something.
What?
You're all dudes.
You know, she's right. It's true. She's not wrong. These thought experiments, Hobbes, Locke, to a lesser extent maybe Rousseau, these experiments are always populated by, or at least they center the experience of an adult, independent man. Held's feminist critique is that it's not a universal human experience that's being represented by these social contract theorists. Their vision of what a human is by nature might be too narrow. And the radical move that Held makes is to say, okay, so all these dudes out there in the state of nature, where are their mothers? Because it's not as if people come from nowhere, that people find themselves in the state of nature and have to decide how they're going to organize themselves. That's not how human beings work.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
And Virginia Held takes this image of the mother and embarks on her own thought experiment. On the face of it, it seems plausible to take the relation between mother and child as the primary social relation. Since before there could have been any self-sufficient independent men in a hypothetical state of nature, there would have had to have been mothers, and the children these men would have had to have been. Held then asks us to reconsider the way we think about political relationships. And instead of comparing that to a contract, she says, what if we think of it in terms of the mother-child relationship? If we think of mother-child relationships instead of contractual relationships as being the building block of human community, how does that change the way we understand our rights and obligations? The relation between mothering person and child, hardly understandable in contractual terms, may be a more fundamental human relation and a more promising one on which to build our recommendations for the future than is any relation between rational contractors. For starters, parents and children don't exist in this kind of contractual relationship where, well, I will do this for you if you do this for me. Parents are very often willing to sacrifice of themselves. Sorry, there's some construction. There's a truck going by. Trucks. What is it with the trucks? Outside, very slow and loud truck is going by outside. Driving me crazy. For starters, parents are often willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of their children. Parents give up their time and their energy, their money, a lot of money, and we give these things up not because we're expecting a return on investment, but we do it out of a kind of natural goodwill towards our progeny. We have this natural hope and desire for future generations to do better. Truck sounds, dump truck maybe? Yeah, it's a dump truck. It's a dump truck. So generally speaking, parents have a natural goodwill towards their children. We have a natural desire and hope that our children will do well and even better than we will. And as humans, we're willing to invest resources towards a future that we will not be alive to see. Now just think for a second, if that were the paradigm of society, how would that change the way we think about political community? Would we no longer be thinking about, well, I pay my taxes, so I expect this in return? Would we instead think that, well, I'm paying my taxes so that the future will be better than the present? It's worth thinking about. Now you could critique Held, and you could say, wait a second, first of all, lots of mother-child relationships are not like this. And second, I don't even think the mother-child relationship is analogous to political community. But actually, this is exactly Held's point. She acknowledges that, this vision of the mother-child relationship is not like a universal model of the human experience. But her point is, neither is this image of the independent, rational contract signer. That too is kind of a narrow vision of what a human being is. And if that's the case, we ought not to think about political community strictly as a contract. The real utility of the social contract as a metaphor for politics is that it focuses our attention on the collective and collaborative nature of politics. And it also teaches us that political legitimacy, that the legitimacy of a government depends upon agreement and consent. This is what makes the social contract such a persuasive account in democratic contexts, especially. When we think of a government that's for the people and by the people, we think of a government that is created by the agreement of the people. But as Virginia Held points out, this is just one framework for thinking about politics, and it has its limitations. So for your next lecture on political philosophy, take a look at this video over here. I will see you there, and I'll talk to you soon.